And the first question is, take it back to let's take it back to an earlier time. When did you awaken to environmental issues, especially water issues?
You know, I grew up in St. Louis Park, and so I wasn't near the Mississippi River. Did some, like most kids, did church camps up at the BWCA, went with my family to Lake Superior. My mother's family was from Wyoming and had and has to this day a small ranch in southern Wyoming with a lot of clean water and rolling brooks and creeks, as we call them out there. And you know, I had a general sense of the importance of clean water growing up. My dad's family was from the East Coast, so we would spend summers. One summer we'd go to Wyoming, so up in sort of a high desert mountainous region. The next summer we'd go to the Atlantic Ocean, and so I had a little contrast about two different water systems, and then lived in the Twin Cities. But like a lot of folks in the Twin Cities, you know, the Mississippi River was something you drove across, and we were Minneapolis people, so we didn't go to St. Paul that often as I was growing up. So really for me, it was becoming involved in state government in the early 70s when I had the good fortune of meeting someone who worked on State Senator Wendell Anderson's campaign for governor. I did not. But he recommended me for a job in the Anderson administration in '71. I actually started out being involved on youth employment programs, working for the late Jim Lord. And within a year, though, I got transferred, promoted, or whatever you want to call it, to conservation environmental issues. And that was during this very robust time in Minnesota where there was a lot of attention given Earth Day and all the environmental problems around the country to the importance of water. So really it was the 1973 legislative session. I'm in the governor's office. The legislature passes, you know, with the support of people like Nick Coleman and Marty Sabo, a whole package of bills, environmental and conservation bills, including the Minnesota Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and very importantly for a discussion of the Mississippi River, the Critical Areas Act. So that was sort of the beginning for me, getting around the state with the governor, getting out on rivers, seeing sort of some of the challenges.
I also need to do a disclaimer or release form, so I need you to say who you are and that you're aware that we're making this documentary and you approve of us using your image in it.
I do. I'm Peter Gove, and you can do anything you want.
Okay. All right. So you said something that triggered something that Mondale said in the 60s. He said it was the high watermark for progressive legislation. Wasn't that a different time than today in terms of actually attacking problems rather than causing problems?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I went back a few years ago for another project, and I looked in the Blue Book, as we all know, which is the annual summary of legislative actions by the Minnesota legislature, and I looked at the 15 or so major bills that were passed in 1973, signed into law all in one day in May of '73 by Governor Anderson. I looked at who the sponsors were on both sides, and it reminded me of the point that first, there were a lot of Republicans or conservatives who were conservation leaders. We don't see much of that today. In fact, today, much of the anti-conservation movement is led by so-called conservatives and Republicans. But at that time, we had in Minnesota people like State Senator Bob Dunn and a whole list of Republicans. And of course, you can't not mention Dave Durenberger because of his work for Harold Levander as executive secretary. So there was a desire to deal with all of the issues with clean air, clean water, solid waste, hazardous waste in a very bipartisan way. And virtually every one of those bills that passed in '73 had very important lead authors from the Republican side. We don't see that today.
You were pretty young when you were appointed PCA commissioner. How did that
I think at the time I was the youngest commissioner in Minnesota state government history. I don't know if that's any longer the case. I was a ripe old 25, and I was working for the governor, and my predecessor, who's, you know, at that time and still today the finest director or commissioner of the PCA this state has ever had, Grant Merritt, was a lawyer. He had made a substantial financial sacrifice to be in state government. He had served a full term for Governor Anderson and had told the governor during the '74 campaign that he would like to move back to the private sector in '75. And I was just fortunate enough to be working in the governor's office, and I have always been thankful to Governor Anderson at that appointment, but as or more importantly, I was thankful to his very well-known and renowned executive secretary, Tom Kellum, because really it was Tom that took the chance on me to go over there. So it was an unbelievable experience, and at the time, in fact shortly thereafter, it became very clear to me as I got into water quality issues what a challenge we had on the Mississippi River. I was taken down to the Pig's Eye plant, and I learned a little bit about the dilution is a solution to pollution, but until you get to the Pig's Eye plant, at least in the '70s, you didn't understand some of the challenges that we faced, because at that time, even though we had, by most people's standards, a pretty modern plant, it was only so-called secondary treatment, and the amount of effluent that was going into the Mississippi was just outrageous, and we knew it, and the state knew it. There had been a bonding bill passed that year to allow municipalities, including the Met Council, to try to do more from a secondary or tertiary treatment. We also knew there were major hazardous waste issues, PCBs, lime waste, etc., along the Mississippi. So, you know, my interest in water issues in the Mississippi and the importance of protecting the Mississippi was heightened during that time of the PCA, and it was during that period of time, '75, '76, that the first significant move during that period of time, 1975, 1976, as a result of a Citizens League study in 1974 that recommended that the Mississippi River in the metropolitan area be protected as a state critical area, that the then Minnesota Environmental Quality Board, I was then a member of the board as the PCA director, voted to designate what is essentially the Mineral Corridor today as the state's first critical area based on the 1973 statute. And I give a lot of credit both to the Metropolitan Council and to the Citizens League, and then citizens such as Tom Kelly, for bringing that issue to the attention of the state. So in mid-1976, based on the '73 law, the Mississippi was designated a state critical area, and that then led to an interest thereafter for federal legislation that we can talk about.
I'm going to just move that mic just a little bit because it's getting a little fabric.
Okay.
It's hardly noticeable, but when you move around it.
Yeah, I'll try not to move around.
That's all right. Now it won't be a problem. Okay, so okay, let's do a sound check.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Excellent. Okay. I don't think Wendell Anderson ever got enough credit for a lot of things he did, but do you think he deserves a lot of credit in the environmental area that he's not gotten?
Well, I think, you know, there is no governor in Minnesota history, and I say that because Mark Dayton's term is not yet complete, that did as much to protect and preserve Minnesota's resources as Anderson. There were these 14 or 15 bills signed into law in one day in 1973, including Wild and Scenic Rivers, Critical Areas Act, State Power Plant Siting Act, Minnesota Environmental Policy Act. The governor presided over the Minnesota establishment of Voyageurs National Park. The St. Croix River was added to, the lower St. Croix was added to the federal zone. And I think he was very courageous in terms of taking positions on nuclear waste management, solid waste recycling. So no, I don't think he's gotten appropriate credit, and I think that's in part because when he moved to the Senate, the BWCA issue became so overwhelming for all politicians in Minnesota, including Wendy, and that the result of the '78 election, I think, has impacted his legacy unfairly.
You were talking earlier about how environmental concerns used to be bipartisan. Governor Quee wasn't actually so bad on a number of key issues, was it either, was it?
No, I mean, and Al Quee is someone that I worked with when he was in Congress. I've worked with him since on a nonprofit board, and he was a good governor for conservation issues. He actually reissued the critical areas designation proclamation that Anderson first issued in '76. Quee reissued it in '79. He was very supportive of the work of both the PCA and the DNR.
It appears that you've been present at the creation of a lot of good things when it comes to environmental issues. I'm thinking of your involvement in MNRA, the rebirth of the St. Croix River Association. So where did that motivation come to devote so much?
Well, first I had this great opportunity when I was young in what I call my public sector career to be the environmental staff person for this great environmental governor. Had the chance to then run the PCA for a couple of years during a very turbulent time, reserve mining, U.S. Steel, power plant issues, etc. And then when Anderson went to Washington after Mr. Mondale was elected vice president, I had a chance to work on the Hill on a number of important environmental issues. And then when he was not reelected to a full term, with the help of then Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Robert Herbst, who had been the DNR commissioner in Minnesota, I had a chance for about 2.5 years to have a dream job for anybody in conservation, which was assistant director of the National Park Service and in charge of legislation. And during that time, worked on a number of bills, including establishment of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Martin Luther King site, the Kalapapa site in Hawaii, and that sort of just ingrained in me, if you will, that this is important work. And even though I left government at that time and spent 27 years in the private sector with two great Minnesota technology companies, I maintained my interest in these issues as a citizen, frankly, and was fortunate enough to work for two companies that gave me a chance to do that. And that's where most of my work on the Mississippi River actually has occurred as a citizen working in the business community.
Hey, Peter, it seems like the way human beings are wired, if you're driving down I-94 in a couch straw off the back of a pickup truck, we can react to that, we can understand that. But when you have some kind of existential threat, like the destruction of the planet because of mankind's behavior, do you ever think about that? And it kind of frustrates what we try to do.
Well, I think it's particularly true in dealing with water quality issues with rivers, because the rivers are constantly moving. It's hard sometimes to make the case to an upstream user what their obligation is to the downstream user, but we're in a state that's blessed with such abundant surface and groundwater resources that we just can't for a moment take those for granted. And we're starting to read now in terms of issues with impaired waters. I think there are 100 or so lakes in Minnesota that are impaired, are on the EPA list. Part of this, the beloved St. Croix River is impaired. We have the Mississippi River, of course, is affected by ag pollution from the Minnesota River. Particularly, you can see that at Fort Snelling. So I think some of these issues are a little harder to articulate, but I sort of approach these issues from what a guy that I work for at the Park Service said was the grandchildren test, which is, are you working on something that may not benefit you, but certainly is going to help your kids or your grandkids? And that's sort of the way I've approached a lot of these issues. And there's a famous quote from Gaylord Nelson to that effect, that you know, sometimes we do things that we won't get credit for now, but are going to have a big impact down the road.
So who were your environmental heroes?
Well, I think, you know, during that era, obviously Governor Anderson, Willard Munger has to be very high on the list in terms of a legislator, but there are a lot of legislative leaders on environmental issues during that time. Bruce Vento, who was in the legislature before he went to Congress. I mentioned Bob Dunn, Roger Moe, even in his early years, Win Borden, before he decided to sort of make the switch politically. And then I've mentioned Dave Durenberger because of his work for Harold Levander. And then on the national scene, I had a chance to work with Cecil Andrus, with Bruce Babbitt, and other congressional leaders.
Turning now back to MNRA, things don't happen; they're made to happen. So, take us back to what happened that made this kind of unconventional park come into existence.
Well, it was, you know, a several step process that in retrospect looked a little more structured maybe than it was. I mean, we have to start with the fact that we have these two cities sitting on a unique stretch of the Mississippi River, where you have the largest falls structure, you've got a gorge, and you've got a prairie river. You have two cities who are where they are today because of the river, and you have a system of rivers where you have the Mississippi coming down from its source, going through this major metropolitan area. You have the Minnesota coming in from the Minnesota River Valley, a major agricultural area, and then downstream a bit you have the St. Croix, which was one of the first rivers designated under the national system. So in, you know, for decades, the Mississippi was basically like every other river in this country, you know, sort of the dumping ground for liquid and solid and hazardous waste. That's just the way things were in this country. But starting in, I would say, the late 60s, with some of the issues around the country with water quality challenges, and also here in the Twin Cities, I think the establishment of the Metropolitan Council in 1968 and the Metropolitan Waste Control Commission shortly thereafter sort of set the stage for cooperative regional planning on water quality. And we'll just focus on water quality and not talk about air or solid waste. But the Met Council figured out pretty early on that it couldn't have every municipality dealing with its own municipal waste. There had to be a regional system. And remember, at that time and until this day, you had cities dumping into the river and you had cities using the river for drinking water supply. Everybody in Minneapolis, you know, when they open up their tap, that's the Mississippi River, and for some people in St. Paul and around the metropolitan area, that's the same. So you had sort of this juxtaposition, you know, barely treated waste going in the river, using it for water, drinking water. I mean, it just wasn't going to work on a long time basis in a growing area. So the Met Council did a study in 1970 about the Mississippi River and challenges for the river, both environmental and economic. The Critical Areas Act was passed in '73, giving the state the ability to designate a certain landscape or river segment as needing additional protection. And then in 1974, the Citizens League, which has played such an important role in this community for 50 plus years from a public affairs and public policy standpoint, you know, recommended that the Mississippi River in the Twin Cities area, essentially today's MNRA corridor, be designated as the first state critical area. And that was done in 1976. And I had the privilege of voting for that critical area designation, and that was because of work by citizens, by the Citizens League, and by folks, metropolitan legislators that knew that some sort of regional approach to clean up the Mississippi was necessary. Let's remember in the mid-70s that, you know, people would not swim in the Mississippi, couldn't swim. There were warnings about it was not safe. You couldn't, fishing was not so good in most of the area because of the pollution. If you did catch a fish, you probably should eat it. Yet we were, most of the people in the metro area were also getting their water from the Mississippi River. So the critical area designation sort of got things in motion. And then in mid-1979, a bipartisan group of congressional leaders from Minnesota, I think motivated by concern about the health of the Mississippi River, knowing that there were 25 or more local units of government along this stretch of the river, knowing the historic importance of the river as a working river, led by Bruce Vento, but joined by, in a bipartisan way, by Tom Hagedorn and Arlen Erdahl and Marty Sable, and then Dave Durenberger, came to the National Park Service. And I was fortunate at the time to be at the Park Service and was in that meeting with then Director Bill Whalen, where Bruce and Dave basically asked the Park Service to study this section of the river in terms of potential national designation. The way the Park Service worked then and now, for an area in this country to be considered a unit of the national park system, there has to be some sort of a study of national significance. And the Park Service did that study late 1979 and 1980, and it led to a recommendation that the Congress adopted in the waning hours, really, of the Carter administration in December of 1980. In an omnibus park bill, the Congress found that the Twin Cities metropolitan area was nationally significant and needed additional protection, and set up a commission, the Metropolitan River Corridor Study Commission, made up of federal and state officials and citizens, to look at the Mississippi and the Minnesota and the St. Croix as a river system and make recommendations for specific federal legislation. Literally, I think the last week of the Carter administration, then Secretary Cecil Andrus, based on recommendations from a variety of state and local officials, appointed a commission to do that job. And at the time, even though I was living in Washington but planning to move to Bloomington, Mayor George Latimer, appointed me one of the citizen members of that commission. That commission was led by the late Ray Black, who was one of the first directors of the Citizens League, and as I said, had folks from federal agencies, state agencies, and citizens. And that group was supposed to, over the next couple of years, come up with some recommendations on better protection and management for the Mississippi, and also take a look at the Minnesota and the St. Croix. However, President-elect Reagan's new Secretary of the Interior, Jim Watt, came into power with a mandate from the new president to reduce or eliminate advisory commissions. The Reagan campaign had one of its tenets to reduce, the size and scope of government, and advisory commissions were one of the targets. So, what was the first new advisory commission that Jim Watt had put on his desk the first week he was the new Secretary of the Interior? Was this Metropolitan River Corridor Study Commission in the Twin Cities. And so guess what happened? He basically said, we're not funding this commission. So for 2 or 3 years, we would meet every quarter to talk about how we would do this study on the three rivers. And basically there were no funds to do the study because that was the way the Reagan administration was going to control the supposed growth of advisory bodies. So after a couple of years, two very creative folks, Senator Dave Durenberger and the late Harvey Nelson, who was then the regional director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, somehow found a way, still a little bit mysterious to me, that Harvey could find, with Dave's help, because he was on the Senate Appropriations Committee, probably a little line item or rider in a legislative report. They found just enough money in that report through the Fish and Wildlife Service to fund this study. This was maybe by now '83. And Jim Watt's attention was turned to other things, and maybe he was no longer the secretary. I don't know how long he lasted. He was quite a controversial character. And this study was started at that time with the support of the Metropolitan Council and an outside contractor. And to make a long story short, that led to a report to designate the Mississippi as a national river, a unit of the National Park Service in the mid-'80s. And that by then, the late Bruce Vento, who, one reason this science museum is here is because of Bruce and this visitor center. The late Bruce Vento, that's all he needed. And he introduced a bill to establish the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area as a unit of the National Park System. At the time, fortunately for MNRA, Bruce was then chairing the National Park Subcommittee of the House Resources Committee, so he had a lot of leverage. Dave Durnberger introduced a bill slightly different in terms of how the relationship between the Park Service and the local units of government would work on the Senate side, and in 1988 the bill was passed and MNRA became a unit of the National Park System. And then that began the next process, which we can talk about.
Okay, we need to shut the cameras down for a second.
We are now.
All right. I remember the sewer separation in St. Paul. Remember they were dumping Ross rainwater.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, so one of the issues facing all metropolitan areas, and interestingly today, several major metropolitan areas still face this issue, is what was called combined sewer overflow, which was the sanitary sewer and the runoff sewer from rainfall were the same system. So when there was a big rainfall, the water would overflow the sanitary sewer and raw sewage would go into a river or lake. And that was standard operating procedure in this country until starting in the late 60s and 70s. And one of the initiatives that was identified in the Twin Cities by the Metropolitan Council and the Metropolitan Waste Control Commission in the mid-'70s was to move towards separated sewers. And actually, Rudy Perpich, deserves most of the credit for that, because it was during his first term that he basically bit the bullet. It was very expensive and mandated through a combination of federal, state, and local funds that sewers be separated in this country. If you go around the country today, and I'm involved with the Great Lakes Protection Fund, and we get reports on water quality around the Great Lakes, and several major cities, including Cleveland and I think Buffalo, still are under consent decrees with the EPA and the Justice Department because they haven't moved fast enough, this is 2015, to separate their sewers. So in some parts of this country, there's still combined sewer overflow. Fortunately, in this state, and to the benefit of the Mississippi River, that was done very early on in the evolution of this issue for the United States.
So we talked a little bit about what was happening at the federal level, but wasn't there kind of a huddle of group of people back here in Minnesota that were instrumental in promoting MNRA?
Well, I think if you look at the citizens, I was just reviewing who testified in front of the Citizens League for the 1974 report, and one name is consistent with all these reports, and that's the late, great Tom Kelly from St. Paul. Tom was such an advocate for better protection of this river. And then we had the Citizens League, Clean Water Action, the Sierra Club, the Isaac Walton League. A lot of nonprofit groups that are still in existence today were concerned about water quality in the Twin Cities area. At that time, Excel, then NSP, had some issues with PCB contamination in the river, so did 3M. And the city of Minneapolis had a big problem with lime sludge from their water control plant, and a lot of citizen groups were paying attention to this issue, and that really was in part behind the critical area designation, the bonding bill that passed in the '73 session to provide some funds, state funds, to local units of government to clean up the river. So when we look at the MNRA history, clearly citizen involvement, led by, I think you have to always give proportionate credit to Tom Kelly, was one of the motivating factors. Once the bill was introduced, fortunately on Dave Durnberger's staff, you had Shirley Hunt, who was from Edina on 9 Mile Creek, had a deep abiding interest in water quality issues from her part of the metropolitan area. She became Dave's conservation environmental aide, and she and the people on Bruce's staff, including his longtime chief of staff, Larry Romans, were involved in getting the bill passed, and then setting us up through the Metropolitan River Corridor Study Commission and thereafter to start the process to really stand up this park. And the legislation passed in 1988. The legislation set up a citizen commission working with the Park Service to develop what in Park Service lingo is a general management plan. And that commission, I had the privilege of being the first chair appointed by the Secretary of the Interior, and I was a citizen chair. By that time, I was working for Control Data. This was a commission of federal agencies, state agencies, and a few citizens, and they wanted a citizen to chair it. Bruce wanted a citizen chair, not an agency chair. And so I get this phone call that congratulations, the bill has passed. A commission has been set up. Mr. Vento has recommended to Secretary of the Interior that you be the chair, and I said fine. I went to my colleagues at Control Data and got their permission to do it, and that led to a several-year process to develop the general management plan for the Mississippi River. And we had a great group of people working on that, both from the agency side and the citizen side, some of whom were involved in Mississippi River protection issues at the time. Some are still involved today in organizations like Friends of the Mississippi River. The first superintendent came to town, bill passed in '88. The first superintendent, Norm Regal, who unfortunately tragically died of cancer within a year of being assigned here, first came to town in about 1990. The plan was completed in 92 or 93. It was supported by Governor Carlson. Governor Carlson both, again, from a bipartisan standpoint, both reissued the critical area designation during his term in office and supported the Mississippi National River and state companion legislation, and was very instrumental in bringing to public attention the problems of Minnesota River ag pollution on the Mississippi River. So the Secretary Babbitt came to town in, I think, the summer of '95 and signed the general management plan for the Mississippi National River. So I think MNRA was passed in '88, but really we've now had 20 years of management of this resource by the Park Service and its partners pursuant to the general management plan.
So it seems like, people came, of course the Indians were here before us, but when the Europeans came here, they went to the river, located on its banks, spent the next 100 years befouling it with every possible thing they could. We turned away from the river for a number of decades. But what's really remarkable to me is how we're kind of turning around and going back to the river now, and I wonder if MNRA hasn't had some role in that.
Well, I absolutely. I mean, you think about it. I remember we had a series of public hearings on the MNRA draft plan, and we went around the Twin Cities area, our commission, and held hearings. And I remember we held one hearing. I don't know what building it was in. It was in the St. Anthony Falls area, which, remember, in the early '90s, I think La Rive was the only condo on the river at the time. The rest of the buildings were old flour mills, hadn't been renovated, nothing like we see today. And the most remarkable turning back to the river, I think, in the Twin Cities area occurred in that Mississippi waterfront in Minneapolis. But at the time, we would go to these hearings, and it's one of the reasons that Friends of the Mississippi started. We went to these hearings and to talk about this plan. And this plan for the river was what was called a balanced plan, where we'd continue to clean up the river, provide public access to the river, make sure there was compatible development, because we had 25 local units of government, and the MNRA plan mandated certain development guidelines, but recognize that we had a working river here, a working river hauling hundreds of tons of corn and grain and coal and other products up and down the river. through a system of locks and dams maintained by the Corps of Engineers. And we'd go to those hearings on this plan, which had a lot of aspirations in terms of protection and better management. And I was chairing the hearings as the chair of the commission, and I'd look out in the audience, and A, there weren't many people there, and B, I could pretty much see who was there. There would be, and all of course appropriate, the lobbyists for the Waterways Association, the lobbyists for barge folks, lobbyists for XL, lobbyists for 3M, lobbyists for the railroads, and I didn't see many folks from the general public, and that's in part because the Renaissance rediscovery of the river had only begun, because water quality was starting to get better, and developers were figuring out that, hey, there's an amenity here that we need to take advantage of. Same thing in St. Paul, but lesser so at the time. The St. Paul, call it Riverfront Renaissance, started a bit later under the leadership of Mayor Norm Coleman and people like Jay Coles and the St. Paul Foundation getting by the Great River Plan and the Great River Greening Organization. So yeah, there's been quite a change in attitude, but at the time I was concerned that this was a federal planning process. You had to have in the record testimony supporting the plan. The plan talked about maintaining the working river, but the plan also talked about more green space, a cleaner river, better public access, more parks, compatible development. And I was trying to figure out where the environmental and conservation community would come in. There was no group focused on the Mississippi River. There were statewide conservation, water, hunting, fishing groups, no group. And fortunately at the time, for MNRA and for the Mississippi River and for everybody in the metropolitan area, the McKnight Foundation had voted to start to fund initiatives and organizations focused on cleaning up the Mississippi River, not just in Minnesota, but throughout the whole region. And the program officer at the time, a guy by the name of Dan Ray, who needs to be recognized in the history of MNRA and Friends of the Mississippi, and I were at a meeting, I think it was a hearing of the commission, meeting with local units of government from St. Paul, and after the hearing I lamented as the chair to Dan Ray that, the public was not being heard in this process, and all of the, I'll use the word special interests, but all of the private interests had full-time staff or lobbyists there. In fact, for a while I had somebody, a lobbyist for 3M, following me around to all of these meetings. I didn't understand it at the time. I figured it out later. And so Dan Ray said, the McKnight Foundation has just started this new Mississippi River program. I think we would provide seed capital for a new nonprofit that was focused on the Mississippi River and this new national park. And that's how Friends of Mississippi started in 1993 with what was then Project Environment, now the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, became the fiscal agent. 3 or 4 of us were incorporators. We then formed the first board. The first board, interestingly, there were 4 of us, including a gentleman who was then working for the Corps of Engineers, who was an historian, who's now the superintendent of the Mississippi National River, John Anfinson, Senator Bob Dunn's son, George Dunn, and a representative of the waterway industry, Håkon Miller. We were the 4 initial FMR board members, and we were then able to have sufficient funds to hire a initial person who provided comments to the Mississippi National River Plan on what I would call public access, amenities, water quality, to sort of balance, if you will, all the testimony from the river interests. And the rest is history from FMR, and I couldn't be prouder or happier of what that organization has done over the last 20 years as being the advocacy group in support of the National Park Service. But I also couldn't be prouder of the work of the Park Service. First Joanne Cairo, then Paul Labovitz, and now John Anfinson, who've been really great leaders for this unique urban park that started out with very little land, doesn't have much land today, and has to manage relationships with 20-something county and local units of government, plus, maintain the Park Service, preserve and protect authority.
So, back when this was being organized, was there a great deal of opposition from homeowners or local units of government about usurpation of rights?
Well, yeah, I think one of the issues, sure, as it that was not a surprise. I mean, you had along the 72-mile stretch of the river, John Empfinson has the precise number, but I'd say 25 or so local units of government who all have zoning authority for a certain segment of the river, and a lot of ownership, if you will, for that. And MNRA comes in with this federal layer, and one of the goals of MNRA is to have some consistent development guidelines for the river in terms of height, setback, scale, and public access. So that's been, certainly from the beginning, a challenge for MNRA, and it continues to this day. One of the major issues that Friends of the Mississippi is working on with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources are a new set of rules, the Mississippi River Critical Area Rules, that deal with the relationship between these particular local units of government, the Park Service, and the river. And it's a constant tension, but in the end, I think the broader community interest is important, which is we have a national park in the Twin Cities. It's been designated by the Congress, and it deserves support, including from these local units of government. But of course, there are tensions.
The National Park Service has a wide array of properties. The big emblematic parks like Yellowstone or Glacier, but it also has Civil War battlefields. It has the White House, other monuments, and yet even in that context, there's something creative and unusual about this particular park.
Well, when MNRA was established in 1988 as Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, I think at the time there were a handful of other urban parks or urban river parks, and not too many more have been designated since that time. But the National Park System is this broad and wonderful collection of everything from the so-called crown jewels of Yellowstone and Yosemite and the Grand Canyon to a lot of battlefields, to historic sites, the White House, etc. And MNRA and other urban parks or designated rivers are a subset of that system of now, I think, 408 units of the National Park System. I might be off by one or two. At the time when MNRA was established as a partnership park, because of very little traditional land ownership or law enforcement authority, it was pretty unique. But now, and this is, illustrated by the recent report from the Park Service in terms of its urban emphasis and trying to get more younger and diverse populations to come to national parks, MNRA is much more in the mainstream. But you look around the country and you have Cuyahoga in Ohio, you have the Chattahoochee, you have other urban rivers, and communities around this country that are river communities are rediscovering the riverfront, and they'd love to have a river national park. A lot of areas would love to have what we have in the Twin Cities. So I think MNRA, the timing for MNRA in 1988 was great. It may even be better now because of the interest of people moving back to the city, river recreation, cleaner waters, but yet there are still challenges, and that's why vigilance and diligence is needed.
Doesn't it seem kind of interesting, given the role that the Mississippi's played in the history of this country, that it would that it took until about 1988 to create a national park that was solely dedicated to the Mississippi?
Well, it's interesting. The Mississippi starts in northern Minnesota, wends its way through 11 states, I believe, draining 40% of the country, 2,500 plus miles. And while there have been a number of battlefields, Civil War battlefields along the river designated. This remains the only national river segment of the 2,500-mile Mississippi, which is interesting in its own right. I think in part because major sections of the Mississippi are designated wildlife, Fish and Wildlife Service areas. But you know, MNRA is unique as a designated national river on the Mississippi. You would think more segments would be designated, but when you take a step back, I guess there are these a lot of Civil War battlefields, there are several fish and wildlife areas, but this model, I think, could work in other places around the country. And I think if the politics were different in this country right now, I think this model could be replicated, and I'm hopeful in the years to come it will be replicated in other areas along the Mississippi or other major metropolitan areas.
So do you think the water quality in the Mississippi has improved over the years, and what part did legislation play in that? What part did MNRA have an influence in or driving a quest for it?
Well, if you go back to the history, if you look at the history of improving the quality of Mississippi River water in this state, going back to, let's say, the mid to late 60s with the establishment of the Met Council, then the establishment of the Metropolitan Waste Control Commission, and Federal Clean Water Act, etc. You know, water quality fundamentally is a lot better. The river, you can fish in certain segments of this river and catch trophy walleyes and safely eat them. People swim in this river in the northern and southern reaches, and they swim generally without risk. And most industrial, in fact, all the industrial point sources are under permit. Maybe there are some issues with some of those permits, but they're under permit. All municipal sources are under permit. The major remaining issue for the Mississippi is unregulated agriculture pollution, primarily from the Minnesota River. And if you have an aerial shot of the Mississippi and the Minnesota River, that's all you need to illustrate this issue. Until this country gets serious about dealing with ag non-point pollution, we're not going to be able to continue to clean up the Mississippi River. But generally in the Twin Cities, water quality is better. Just start again. Generally in the Mississippi, water quality is better. See?
All right. Biggest threats to the river right now?
Well, I think there are, I'd say three. One, and this one is probably the most important issue, and it's been one that's been with us, you know, since the passage of the Clean Water Act, which is the Clean Water Act regulated all point sources of pollution in this country except agriculture. So unregulated agriculture pollution, so-called non-point pollution, remains the #1 challenge to the Mississippi River and rivers in this country. And kudos to Governor Dayton for his proposed buffer bill that part of it at least got approved this year by the legislature, but finding a way to improve non-point ag pollution to the Mississippi is key, because that affects Lake Pepin, it affects the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. #2, and this is something that if you read the Comprehensive Management Plan in 1994, the issue of invasive Asian carp was not even thought of at the time. You know, Asian carp were introduced in the lower Mississippi in the 70s to control exotics at the time, and they broke out of those pens and they've been making their way up the Mississippi. And they are voracious eaters, and they disrupt commerce and recreational boating. So protecting the Mississippi, particularly the upper Mississippi, Lake Mille Lacs, the headwaters reservoirs, is a major challenge. And fortunately, the Minnesota congressional delegation, led by Senator Klobuchar and Representative Ellison, were able to pass a bill, an historic bill, to close a lock on the Corps of Engineers lock system, the Upper St. Anthony lock, to at least in part protect the Mississippi watershed. That was something we didn't, the invasion of invasive carp was something only recently has come to mind, and frankly, it was the Park Service, both here at Minra and over at the St. Croix National River, that really brought it to the attention of state and federal regulators, and I give the Park Service a lot of credit. The third issue is something that's been with us since we established, since the first critical area and the establishment of Minra, and that is development. Development along the river in terms of public access, setbacks, heights, width, all of those issues that affect the view of the river, particularly the downstream view of the river, for visitors and the public and our kids and grandkids. We're fortunate because of the work of the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission going back 40 years when Dave Durenberger chaired that commission, that we have a lot of designated city and county parks along the 72-mile reach of the river. And in those areas, there's a lot of public ownership. But the challenge is always, what's the balance between public access and enjoyment and development? And we're in an era in both Minneapolis and St. Paul where people want to live downtown. They want to live close to the river, which means density. Density usually means height. And so there's every week in the paper now, whether it's in Minneapolis or St. Paul, there's always a discussion of the newest condo or apartment building, less or so office buildings, close to or on the river in terms of height, width, the design amenities, and how that might affect the river. And that's going to be an ongoing challenge here for an urban river and a Park Service, that's trying to provide interpretation and education along that river.
I think my last question, and Tom, I don't know what you've got, but my last question is, do you have a favorite spot on the river?
I love to walk across the Stone Arch Bridge and just think of all the history there, the largest falls on the river. I used to say the only falls, but John Amundsen reminds me that there is a falls in Little Falls. But the largest falls on the river, of course the falls we see now is not quite the falls that Father Hennepin saw. It was a little farther north, and now it's been, cemented over, if you will, and that's its own story. I love to walk across that river in the spring, and I went down there just 2 weeks ago, the day after the lock closed, and that was important for me. I've taken my grandkids there. It's a great place. But I also like to go to the confluence, the two confluences with the Minnesota and the St. Croix, and walk out on Pike Island and look up the Mississippi. Think about all the history there. Look up and see Fort Snelling, the historic Fort Snelling, and I see here in the visitor center there's that great print of the historic fort. Look up the Minnesota and you think about the history of the Minnesota, the Mississippi, the role Fort Snelling played in the history of this country. And then I like to go to Prescott and look up and think of this wonderful St. Croix River, and I always kid the park superintendent for Minra about why they've screwed up the Minnesota and we need the St. Croix to provide a little dilution to the Mississippi. But those are favorite spots on the river. The final one is up by the Coon Rapids Dam, because that's where Friends of Mississippi for 10 years or so started its Mississippi River Challenge. And to be there with 100+ paddlers in kayaks, mostly in canoes, as they started out going down 40 or 45 miles of the river in 2 days was always a thrill for me.
Tom, what have I missed?
Peter, it's just a couple of points I wonder if you could just flesh out a little bit more. You mentioned.
Look at me.
Yep.
And one was the 1974 Citizens League Task Force recommendation for the state critical area designation for the Mississippi River Corridor. And that called for the executive order, which called for, among other things, regulating commercial and industrial development along that corridor. Can you talk a little bit about maybe how controversial that was?
So the critical areas passed in '73, the Critical Areas Act, and that year the Citizens League, one of Minnesota's finest institutions, citizen institution I think we have, started a task force about the Mississippi River, and that task force in late '73, maybe early '74, among its other recommendations, recommended to the Anderson administration that the first use of the Critical Areas Act be to designate the what is now the Minra Corridor. And they held extensive hearings. I observed some of those. I was on the governor's staff at the time. I don't think I testified, but several citizens testified, including Tom Kelly. And that led to the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board, which had a staff and was made up of 5 commissioners and several citizens, in early '76 passing a resolution recommending to the governor the Mississippi be designated as a critical area, and a boundary established, and within that boundary that there be certain controls over and above local zoning, which in my experience with local zoning tends to be a little porous sometimes and too many variances. One of my biggest complaints over the last few decades is this interesting thing called a hardship variance. Too many hardship variants. What is a hardship variance? So there was some controversy at the time, but the critical area was designated, and that boundary, that map, became the map that was actually adopted by the Congress in 1988 for MNRA, and those rules by executive order have been in place for 30-some years until only recently has the legislature authorized a rulemaking procedure that started under the Pawlenty administration, didn't get done, which is its own story, and is now being completed by the Dayton administration to have a little more rigorous set of rules for development. And there is some controversy because each of those local units of government, it's sort of their jurisdiction. It's a classic local control versus public good, broader community issue. And there have been a lot of issues the last 2 years where citizen groups led by Friends of Mississippi River have been working very, very hard to work with the DNR and support the DNR in this rulemaking provision. But if you don't have that overlay, that metro overlay, every local unit of government, it's sometimes just too susceptible to pressure from developers, and all of a sudden you get buildings that should be 3 stories are 8 stories, or buildings that should be 60 feet wide, 100 feet wide, and it's not good for the river, it's not good for views from the river or to the river, and that's been an ongoing challenge of this river and will continue as long as the Park Service and these rules are in place.
What magic was in that executive order that makes it even today the primary land use regulatory framework for protecting the river corridor?
Well, I think the designation in 1976 of what was now the MNRA corridor, the 72 miles from Dayton to Prescott, and establishing a boundary in terms of how far back from the river, in retrospect, was one of the most important accomplishments of the Anderson administration, because it set in place a process that led to a designation of this area as a national park. I don't know if that executive order could have happened 10 or 15 years later. I would hope so, but the magic of it is that 4 governors on a bipartisan basis over a 20-year period adopted and supported that provision. It was very bipartisan, and the concern from local units of government in 1976 or 77 are the same they are today. So there's been this tension back and forth, but if we're going to have a designated national park of a section of the Mississippi River that has national significance, that's what the Park Service study found in 1980. That's what the Metropolitan River Corridor study found in 1986. The first line of the MNRA statute in 1988 is that the Mississippi River in the Twin Cities area is a nationally significant resource and deserves federal designation and protection. It all flows from that.
Along that line, what didn't the state critical area designation do that some, most notably Senator Durenberger, sought to seek federal protections for the river corridor?
Well, Dave's bill in 1987 was a little different than Bruce's bill. Dave's bill probably gave the local units of government a little more authority than Bruce's bill. It was patterned after the, let's stop here, what's the name of that organization in the Upper Miss? The Headwaters Board. There were 2 versions of legislation introduced in 1987. by Representative Vento and Senator Durenberger. The Durenberger bill was patterned after the Headwaters Board, which is the multi-county organization north of the Twin Cities that provides an overlay to local zoning. That I think you would say would give more control to local units of government and less to the state. Bruce's bill basically picked up on the 1976 critical area designation and had the Park Service playing an active role working with local units of government. And in the end, I think as Dave Durenberger would say, and there wasn't a big variance between those bills. In the end, I think Dave saw the wisdom of Bruce's approach for having a designated national river and the presence of the national park system, and he acceded to the House approach, and the bill became law. But signed into law by Ronald Reagan. Let's remember that the MNRA statute was signed into law by President Reagan.
Bad staff work?
I don't know, well, yeah. Bruce prevailed. I think as Dave would say, Bruce prevailed.
Peter, just one more question. This has always fascinated me. You know, with all the many stakeholders that the MNRA touches, can you describe how it governs itself?
The park?
Park.
Well, I mean, we have a superintendent, and the superintendent has certain responsibilities based on the statute and Park Service policy, has a budget, has a boss in Omaha, but the superintendent of this park has to be a partnership person, has very little ownership. I don't remember the number of acres, but it's under 100. There's 54,000 acres in the MNRA corridor. I think the Park Service maybe owns 100 now. When they started out, I think they owned 20, maybe less than 20, and John Anfinson can clarify all that for you. But you know, the superintendent has to be able to play within the Park Service bureaucracy, but also needs to be pretty darn good in dealing with local units of government, interest groups, the surface water transportation industry, which is very strong and very important in this state, particularly the connection to the Minnesota River where all the grain moves down the Mississippi, and needs to be able to be pretty good on his or her feet in dealing with outside groups in the media.
You guys want to see his feet?
We're
We good?
yeah.
All right. Well.